Welcome back to Left Footers. I'm Father Roger Nijelski. With me, I have Father Ayre and Father David Hogman.
Cheers.
Cheers. I want to bring up the topic because I don't know where to stand with Jordan Peterson.
Part of the human collective imagination has cobbled together a library with a plot. And like I see the Bible as an attempt, a collective attempt by humanity to solve the deepest problems that we have.
And I want to hear your guys' opinion about this.
Sure.
So, can you just briefly tell me who he is and what he's doing at the moment?
Well, Father Harrison points to me because I've been reading his books and listening to his lectures for the last few years now. Initially, he's just a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. But in the last few years, when he started writing his book, Maps of Meaning, the question was coming up as to how is it that you can have civilizations willing to destroy the whole world in order to maintain a worldview. That bugged him a lot, especially growing up in the Cold War. He would talk about, it would wake him up in the middle of the night, or it would affect his dreams, and it would have an impact on his ability to understand the world. So, like most people of a certain temperament, his choice was, let's research the question, let's study it. So he started discussing and reading and researching the nature of belief and where it comes from.
So this was before Twitter.
Long before Twitter.
All right, so he wasn't just making, posts out and sort of crying himself to sleep and...
New. So he started doing a lot of the research into this, and so one of the things that he wound up becoming quite open to is not only discussing the psychological research on the nature of belief and how it develops in an evolutionary pattern, but also how it manifests itself in mythology and in ancient traditions. So I wouldn't want to characterize him in any way, because that would... And I wouldn't say that I necessarily know his thoughts, but he's generally speaking a Jungian. And so Carl Jung's major emphasis is on archetypes and how they can have an impact on the overall health of a person. So he would read books like Ayre, and Ayre is one of the ones he describes as one of the most terrifying books he's ever read. And then he would go into old mythological symbols, either to ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, and then he started also using the biblical texts. And so in Maps of Meaning, he actually starts off the book by describing his experience as a young boy going through confirmation classes in the United Church, in which I was raised, and talking about how the faith seemed to him to be empty and in a sense, devoid of content. But then as he started dealing with this fundamental question that was causing him like sleepless nights, he started finding that the biblical stories were actually giving him something that he wasn't getting in some of the other bits of research. Or at the very least was providing him a framework through which he could actually interpret it. So that was quite an interesting deal. So when he eventually got in trouble for resisting Bill C-16 and everything that comes with it.
We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent.
It was primarily because of his research with these questions. What is belief? What is a sense of meaning? And he was profoundly concerned that the means by which tyranny had been imposed on places like the Soviet Union, where they would not only control your body, but also control your mind through lies, deceit, and the changing of language, that he was concerned that this was beginning to be manifested in Canada, because for the first time in English common law history, you had a legal structure telling you what to say.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words.
Well, the revolution will be complete when the language is perfect.
The secret is to move from translation to direct thought to automatic response. No need for self-discipline. Language coming from here, not from here.
Before it was simply, you can't say these things, but now it was, these are the words you must use. And that caused him to go, wait a second. Because if you can control what a person says, then you can subtly get inside the framework of belief, the framework of value, and kill people in their very soul. So when our Lord says, do not fear those who can kill the body, but fear those who can kill body and kill the soul in hell, he would use scriptural passages like that to understand where the real danger lied. So that was the reason why he blared up. But what was interesting is that there's dime a dozen people that will say, oh, I'm against this, blah, 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 right? And it doesn't really go anywhere. But what he found, and this is what I've heard him say, is because he posted all of his lectures from Maps of Meaning, Personality and Its Transformations, his University of U of T lectures on the internet. They'd hear about this guy, what's going on with him, then they'd do the research. They pay attention to what he said. So his words were, they came for the controversy and they stayed for the content. And then that would allow him then to kind of branch out a little bit. So I encountered him soon after the Bill C-16 stuff came out, and that's exactly what happened with me. Okay. I read and I researched it, and I was like, oh, this is fascinating, because it helped me synthesize some of my theological hypotheses with hard scientific data.
And I think that gives a good explanation of why you went to him. But Father Harrison, I'm going to ask you, why do you think people are so interested in this person, in this character?
I think in some ways, I think I'll give way to Father David afterwards, because I mean, I think he's better read with Peterson. He's better in that world than I am. But I do think that if people are popularly going to like psychology classes, they're watching YouTube videos, et cetera, that you're gaining a following, it means you're obviously addressing something that people are lacking in their lives that they want an answer to. And I think a lot of the question does come around the question of meaning, right? Modernity has usurped meaning as a direction for life, and I think it's something that's unavoidable in the human soul. I would say, philosophically speaking, at least, you cannot avoid the question of meaning. If there is no meaning, nothing matters. There is no content to language. It all falls apart, as kind of you're saying, right? So I think people may not even recognize that right away, but they hear his lectures and it speaks something to them about saying, hey, wait, yeah, I am looking for meaning. I am looking for this. And I think there's that. I do think there's a lot of the politics element of it too. Here's someone who is willing to speak up against the quote-unquote leftist worldview that I think legitimately we do get bombarded with a lot. And so they're like, I want something different, and he's someone who's willing to speak out against that. So I think there's that too, and I think that he speaks towards. I've been finding, especially men have found him really intriguing, because he's trying to at least address authentic masculinity in some ways. That these guys, hey, at least it's someone who's addressing the question. Whether he's right or not is the other question, but I think here's someone who's actually willing to address the issue instead of just saying, masculinity bad, feminism good, right? Manhood! Manhood! Harumph, indeed. So...
Harumph! I didn't get a harumph out of that guy.
Give the governor harumph.
My impression is those are the reasons, and I think one way or the other, whether you agree with him or not, it's worth paying attention to him.
Okay.
He's telling you what are the questions that are on people's hearts. And where I find some frustration is that, well, actually the church has given ample explanations for these things in the past. However, obviously we're doing a horrible job at communicating it, because they're going to him and not to us.
Should we be charging $90 per tickets or whatever, and just inviting them into church to listen to one of you priests?
Well, $200 tickets for mass, and it's like, and then it creates a sparsity, and everyone's like, I want to go because it's exclusive. No, I'm kidding.
Well, I will actually say, in terms of writing pastoral satire, I've actually thought about writing a joke about how Catholics, if we really wanted to succeed, we should actually make it an exclusive club. Not that I intend on doing that, but it's people determine value, and this corresponds with the question of meaning. People determine value by what other people want, and it's a difficult thing to be able to tell somebody that this is meaningful, even though apparently nobody seems to want it. But what I find is really quite interesting is that people actually do want to ask these religious questions, right? Like when Father Harrison, both of us are respectively chaplains at schools, children and young people have a deep desire to ask particular questions. What they're generally suspicious of is whether or not we're trying to have them join a cult. And on one level, I think that's...
You're not walking around with Kool-Aid in the halls.
Yeah, well, in a way, and I think you need to give the devil his due. When we tell somebody that they're receiving the body and blood of Christ, we are actually giving them the Kool-Aid. They actually subconsciously accept the fact that we are giving them a death sentence. Baptism is a death sentence. And the question of whether or not that is a calling or a mystery that is beyond what a person can handle is definitely something understandable. Peterson himself hates the idea of being a part of a club. Like people keep asking him, why don't you say whether or not definitively, do you believe in God? And he says, I'm not answering the question because it's a complex question. What do you mean by belief? What do you believe in God? What do you mean by belief in God? And very often people will use him as a means of saying, look, we were right the whole damn time. In fact, there's this one gentleman, so I went to go see Peterson, and there's this guy, up until then, I think he had asked the question 3 times. He'd go, good morning, or good evening, Citizen Peterson, and he'd ask this long, meaningless question. And at the very end, he would try to get Peterson to read a quote from Cardinal Ratzinger. And then after a while, it became apparent that he was just using Peterson as a tool. And I think that's one of the areas in which we fail as evangelists, is we don't love the person, or we want to actually seek the truth. We want to have a party through which we win an agenda. And that's one of the things that I like him for, is that he's coming to the Christian stories, the Old Testament stories, because of the content that they give, not necessarily because of a faction. And strangely, of course, in the psychological fields, it's kind of taken as a given, a datum, that religion is dumb. And so the fact that he's willing to branch out and to give that kind of an expression, I give him a tremendous amount of credit for.
The Garden of Eden is also the holy city. That's another way of thinking about it. Or it's Jerusalem, right? Or it's the ideal state, which could be the ideal city. Or it could be an ideal state of being. Or it could be the ideal psyche. Or it's all of those things stacked up at the same time.
Can I just, I think too, because I think you're right about, like, Catholics are really bad for this. Like, okay, here's our nice little neat system, and if you fit in the box, you're good. And if you don't fit in my box, and it's not the box of the church and faith, which is so vast, there are boundaries, but you have to look hard to find them in some ways, right?
So vast.
So vast. So vast. It's huge. It's a big giant love ball. You're welcome. You're welcome. But I think, so you have people like this, they're trying to manipulate you because they think we just need to get you into this box. And I think it shows us that we've done a horrible job as Catholics in giving intellectual formation to Catholics. Now, not everyone's going to be a Cardinal Newman or a Joseph Ratzinger, etc., of course, right? Not everyone's going to be an academic. But people have serious questions and they want to be taken seriously. And the second that we discount them, they're going to go look for them elsewhere, or they're going to say this question is stupid and I'm done with it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is why the Peterson phenomenon is important, because actually I think it's, in a way, it's showing us, again, we've been bad at this. Like, I still remember, because like I mean, my experience has more been with elementary school than high school. Yeah. But man, kids have good questions, especially at the grade 4 to 6 range. They're starting to think abstractly. They just throwing questions left, right at you. And I remember one class. I was going to go visit one class one day, and one of the kids was asking me about, is the creation story true? Good question. I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, like, did it really happen in 6 or 7 days? Good question. So I explained it to them, right? I said, well, and I use it at their level. I explained to them the idea of different literature. Right? And they said, oh, that makes sense. But before I even did that, the teacher said, no, I don't think Father can answer that question.
Wow.
And I broke my heart, because I thought to myself...
She just assumed you're academic.
Right. Or...
She needs to check her privilege. In that
or they just assumed that actually I don't have the answer. That's what I thought. That's why I took away from it. They didn't have the answer. And this is the problem. It's like if in Catholic education or in our parishes, we're just dumbing down things so much because we think it's kids don't want to be hung up with these deep questions. No, they actually have them. Grade 3 class, one kid's asked me, how do we have free will if God knows everything? Grade 3. Yep. They have good questions. We can give them answers. And when you give them a good answer, they want more questions. Because when I give them a good answer, 20 more questions pop out of it. And I think that's what's been happening. I think it's been a sign in some ways that we as a church have just failed in stuff like apologetics and giving a good formation. Not apologetics in like the proof texting apologetics that we can see.
Please no. Well, one of the things that I've been noticing along this realm is, I probably don't even understand the definitions of them, to be honest with you, but I think that the present situation is a crisis in foundational theology in the modern church. So we haven't even worked out the fundamental principles by which we move. And that's why I found Peterson so interesting, because one of the reasons why he says, what do you mean by believe, is, what do you mean by believe? What you think or what you act out?
I act as if God exists. Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that.
So one of the things that I found to be so interesting about some of his lectures when I was listening to them, but really before like the whole Kathy Newman thing that blew up, he was talking about how human behavior, you learn, for instance, at a very young age, all the different things that you act out performatively. And then there's the distinction between what you do performatively and what you do, these are Benedict's words, but performative and informative words. Mm-hmm. He uses declarative knowledge or performative, I believe. And so how Catholics, for instance, and this was something I noticed as a convert, Catholics have actually instantiated in their behavior what their belief patterns are. And we don't often express or articulate how we believe them, right? So when you challenge a Catholic and say, why do we kneel at the consecration? There's a reason, a significant reason, an important reason. And by acting it out, then hopefully at a certain point it actually becomes aware in your cognition. So one of the other things that I was able to map that on was actually the history of the development of doctrine. So in the early church, for instance, they acted out a belief in the triune God and in the Eucharist and in the significance of baptism. But it took them several centuries to be able to hammer out what that means. Mm-hmm. And almost always the definitive, like, this is why, would be because of the celebration of the sacraments, how they were celebrated, and their meaning, ultimately. So that would teach the church performatively what they were actually doing and what they actually thought. But then the funny thing is that when you live in a multicultural situation like we do now, it's hard to map the performative actions that have developed for centuries in given cultures, and then they all of a sudden get wedged into each other in the Canadian context. It takes hundreds of years for a culture to be able to make them coherent. Yeah. And we're stuck in a situation where they're like this. So I'm sure you notice as a pastor, and I notice as a pastor, that one of the most difficult things to do is to get the different cultural groups to gel with each other, because they actually subconsciously know the languages don't map. And we've been allowing it to be implicit because usually our parishes have been culturally uniform. Especially in parts of Western Canada, they'd be like, there's the French parish, there's the Irish parish, there's the blah, blah, blah. You know, like, we had dioceses split up over language and ethnic grounds. So now we're just being wedged together, and we're wondering why people have different value systems. The value systems are the very basis by which people act. And so what I find so absolutely phenomenal about reading his book, these Maps of Meaning specifically, it allows us to focus on what that means. How does a person act? And what's the relationship between the world, meaning, and value? And that's not a simple question. Now, I haven't been able to watch it because it hasn't been posted, at least by the time of the recording. That's it, I'm done looking at the camera.
Father David loves the camera.
He had a debate with Sam Harris. And the question was, what's the relationship between facts and values? And there's this question that David Hume brought up. He said, can you derive meaning from value? Meaning and value from facts. And Catholics are a strange conundrum. We believe in natural law. So on one level, we agree with Sam Harris, who says that you can develop an ethical framework from facts. But this is the problem. How do you suspend the sense of meaning for the real meaning that they're given? So one of the big questions that Father Harrison and I had to face when we were in seminary here together in this lovely city you call Edmonton is the conundrum of nature and grace. To what degree is nature only fulfilled by the grace of God? This was a question that de Lubac had to face. You wrote a thesis on Maurice Blondel. And so what I've really enjoyed about Peterson is that he, in a sense, speaks for nature. He's done the scientific research. But what's so interesting is that he doesn't have the theological training. And so there's that strange middle that doesn't get anywhere. So he'll go and almost hit a wall at some moments. He can read the biblical passage and say, this might give me a thought, and it kind of allows him to make hypotheses, but there's still a kind of a barrier. And so it's more, I believe, our job to somehow find whatever good he's trying to say without all of the possible Gnostic permutations that he gets from Jung and from himself, and assume the good in him. I've been to some of his lectures, 2 of them. I never got the impression of a huckster. And I've met many. But, you know, like when you just see him, like his eyes are just like actually this is the gesture he makes, like, or this is my favorite actually, with the fingers. You really see him struggling to figure something out. So I want to give him that credit. So it's funny because a lot of Father Harrison's problems with him, I actually share. Mm-hmm. That's what I've found so interesting. But when I wanted to bring up, you know, at least having a conversation about this particular figure, not because of the horrible possibility for clickbaiting. It's like, oh, another video about Jordan Peterson. With
callers here.
But it's like, no, like, I've always enjoyed...
Our merchandise.
Oh, that was a camera reference. Okay. I've always enjoyed having conversations with Father Harrison because I've always kind of respected his insight. But then the funny part is that he and I are so completely opposite.
So freaking opposite.
Don't swear.
I didn't swear. I said frickin'.
Swearing's bad.
I didn't swear.
Anyways.
Flippin'.
Yeah.
We can bleep it out with him.
That'd be awesome. I will just say off the bat though, like, because we've discussed this many, many times, and actually Father David brought up a really good observation about me that I never really thought about. But I was like, yeah, that's true. He goes, it tastes bad. Like, you're about taste. I'm like, yeah, and it's true. Hence, although I would drink Coors Banquet, actually. But it's true. I if it tastes bad, like I have this like almost aesthetic reaction. Like it's not even. I have a very intuitive sense to myself. So if something doesn't hit me right, I may not even be able to give a reason to it right away. But you see that something's not right. You see something's out of order.
Jordan Peterson is the
no.
darker, right?
As far as he's concerned,
he's Bud Light,
and considering he's from northern Alberta, yes.
Like, you can't just, go up to somebody and just start hanging out. But if you go up to some guy and you're like, hey man, can I grab a smoke? Instant buddy.
So Maurice Blondel, great philosopher prior to the Second Vatican Council, really one of the really cool things about our research was seeing actually how much the Second Vatican Council was influenced by his thought. Blondel makes this philosophical argument. He really, like, his form of apologetics is, let's start with the presuppositions of modernity. That there is no transcendence. Let's start with that. There's no transcendence. Everything is contained in this world. It's called immanentism, right? This idea that nothing goes outside the natural universe. So it's great. Let's start investigating that. So he looks into the human soul through a form of philosophy called phenomenology. He actually kind of did it before even phenomenology was really known as a discipline.
Sorry. Guess whose feast day it is today?
St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, a great phenomenologist.
Uh-huh.
And
student of?
of Edmund Husserl, who actually wrote Blondel and asked him to be joining his circle of philosophy, and Blondel said, no, thank you.
Catholic connections.
Catholic connections, indeed. So he starts to look into the soul, and he notices a distinction in the will, essentially. I'm really bare-boning this, but that's okay. He notices a distinction between the willing will and the willed will. So what I want to do and what I actually do. And he notices an insufficiency between the two. That there's an élan, there's a infinitude in the willing will that's never fulfilled in the willed will. And so he starts kind of exploring this throughout all possible manifestations of action, right? His whole thesis is on action. And he comes to a part where he says, listen, there's only two possibilities with this at the end. Either everything is absurd because we just have this desire for something more that we cannot fulfill ourselves, or there's God. Again, really dumbing it down right now. But that's kind of the argument he makes. And he actually destroys absurdism, like way down on page 40 of the thesis.
Absurdism?
Yeah. Like the idea that everything's absurd. Nihilism. Like he's destroying, he really takes down a nihilism and absurdity early on in the thesis to show that it's not a reasonable position to hold.
I was just realizing that Matthew will probably hate us for all the definitions that will be littered around this video.
Absurdism, nihilism, nudism, ontologism, Manichaeism. Let's just throw out all the isms. You could be like Ferris Bueller. I tend to be against all isms.
Isms, in my opinion, are not good. A person should not believe in an ism. He should believe in himself. I quote John Lennon, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me." A good point there. After all, he was the walrus.
When he gets to this, though, is the distinction between nature and grace. He says, I didn't actually say it's God. He calls it the hypothetical supernatural. He says, if there's something in us that says that there's something more, but what that something more is, as a philosopher, I cannot say. I've reached the boundary. I've gone to the absolute limits. And it would be wrong of me as a philosopher to do this. Interestingly, though, at the end of the thesis, last page, he says, I'm taking my philosopher hat off for a second, and let's just think about it. He goes, it is. Say. It's Christianity. But he says, as a philosopher, I can only say that it's necessary that we orient ourselves to something more, but what that something more is for theology to say. When he's writing letters with de Lubac's asking his opinion, he says, whoa, you're asking me to overstep my bounds. I can't as a philosopher. You got to remember the distinction between the two. He doesn't separate them. It's like both orders are almost held by a tiny thread. And that tiny thread is where grace brings and bridges the two together. A good analogy I've used between the nature-grace distinction is that you've kind of got two fields, and you've got a fence, and you've got a door between the two. And that door is where the two kind of meet. So there is a distinction, but they're not separated. And it's important to kind of keep to know that. And I've always really appreciated that, because I think what I appreciate about it is more his apologetical zeal of let's start from where people are at, essentially. Mm-hmm. Let's go from where their fundamental spiritual condition is, and let's show them that it's actually something more. There's a whole bunch of reasons why he thinks this, but I won't go into them now. But and I think it's an important distinction to hold, that a lot of people in general, whether you're agnostic, atheistic, Catholic, Christian, people, you can tell how they are going to be as a person by how they see the relationship between nature and grace. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I found this to be so interesting is that Peterson himself, he recognizes this problem. So when somebody actually says, "What's your definition of God?" he almost just describes it as the ultimate or highest value, which is almost verbatim. It's not verbatim, but it's similar in substance to how Maurice Blondel describes God. So when he says, do you believe in God? His answer is, I act as if God exists, but he can't actually accept it, God, as something that he can know. So that's precise. So it's an interesting problem, but I don't want to fuse the two together. But at the same time, there's a certain analogy to it. But what's interesting is that he came to this conclusion mostly through American pragmatism. And consequently, actually, one of the reasons that I was largely attracted to him is because I think in many ways I'm a pragmatist as well. It's hard to be exactly aware of your premises, but I'm generally a pragmatist. I became a Catholic, for instance, because of the historical data. I said to myself, look, I know what happens to human institutions when they are merely human institutions. I grew up, in churches and all these other things. I've watched them rise, I've watched them fall. And it only takes one terrible minister to make the whole thing fall apart. And then when you see something like the church not only stay the same, but actually renew herself generation after generation after generation, I said to myself, I can only see God acting in that. In him, it's more like the fundamental assumptions of Western civilization are true. Why? Because they work. And and one of the fundamental assumptions about the Western civilization that he understands is true because they work is the dignity and value of the individual person. And this is also one of the reasons that he's such an anti-collectivist, because it's an assumption you can't prove. And in fact, when I work at a high school, it's very interesting because you almost get people go back to a state of nature when they're in high school. You go to a student and you'll say to them, you have intrinsic value made in God's image and likeness. And they're like, yeah. Maybe they'll say they believe it. But what they do when they leave the assembly or the school mass, and then right when they're walking down the hallway, they tease another kid, not necessarily the kids at my school, they're awesome, but they'll tease them. You look ugly, you're stupid, you have no meaning, you have no purpose. So you actually see a state of nature in people's behavior. And the greatest miracle for me as well in looking at Western Christianity was actually watching the faith gradually get people out of a pagan mentality that people have value because of what they can do. There has to be something transcendent about the human person, but it is irreducible. You can't prove it. And so he realized, and so one of the reasons that he started looking at the Christian tradition is because it's through the Judeo-Christian tradition that this hypothesis came into the human experience. And the reason why Western civilizations work, according to him, is because of this hypothesis. So you can't have a collectivist system without destroying all of these things that hold there. So when he says, I act as if God is true, is because that's the only way, metaphysically, that you can actually maintain the assumption. So that's why, in a sense, he's a bit of a pragmatist, and why he kind of approaches it the way that Blondel does. And what's even more interesting is that he puts the philosophy of action in that framework.
Except Blondel was not a pragmatist.
No.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, of course, great. But by your fruits you shall know them. If he holds that at all, then, like, for instance, that's the definition by which I'm a pragmatist. American pragmatism goes up to a certain point. So in the case of the long-term question of how do we get these values, where did they come from, and how do we maintain them, an emphasis on the Judeo-Christian thing is important. But then going back to the action piece, if you actually form your character through action, and your willing will is striving after it, and so it's an infinite end being sought by an infinitely desiring will, but it's articulated in a finite structure. You are inherently bound to the limitations of your structure, seeking something that is beyond you, which is a conundrum. It's a metaphysical problem, an infinite desire with a finite structure. But what's so interesting is that the more research we've done into the brain and into consciousness, that's exactly what the data is now telling us. Like, it's an interesting revelation now, not revelation in the theological sense, but a revelation in the sense of contemporary science. And not that I even know very much about it, that's why I'm so thankful to Dr. Peterson, is it actually puts into words, scientifically, something that as a philosopher and as a theologian, I've just taken as almost like a willed will that I couldn't put into words. Like, it was so interesting to have a guy who doesn't profess my faith making the same conclusions.
I want to ask one final question.
Yo, barely touched my beer.
I want to make a quick buck, and I want to know what is the best bet. So I want to know both of your predictions of what Peterson's thought will be like in the future. What is it leading towards? Will something happen? Will he change? What are you predicting?
So,
where should I put my money on?
Here, I mean, I'm going to be more pessimistic, obviously, but I've been reading, and I've listed on audiobook form the 12 rules for living, and I found it boring.
You're not a lobster?
I'm not a lobster.
What's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger, so he looks bigger.
I found it boring. That's my, and part of it was, I'm like, man, if we could just be better communicators, Christianity not only teaches some of this, but teaches it better. But that's the aside. My criticism, and I know it's a criticism of a friend of the show, Brett Fawcett, he's looking so much for like archetypal theory and stuff like that in the biblical stories that he's going to, like, actually, Brett put it this way. I thought it was like brilliant. It kind of like I was thinking something like this, but I couldn't put a word to it, and he kind of put it for me. It was, he's either going to become Catholic or he's going to start a cult. He has to because with the Blondell thing, he has to actually push himself to the limit, recognize the limit, accept the limit, and realize that there's something more that completes himself, that he can't complete himself. If you don't do that, you become a cult. Because if there's no grander meaning, the meaning resides with me, the great guru, who has all the answers. So I see it, either he's going to, and I really, with his trajectory, I can't see how he could become anything but Catholic if he were to enter a religious tradition. I don't see Buddhism. I don't see Hinduism at all.
Orthodoxy?
I think, I don't know. If he likes the Western tradition specifically so much, I would have a hard time seeing him become Orthodox. It's possible, but or Eastern Catholic, who knows? But for me, that's the two options. And if it becomes the latter option, there'll be some revisions to his theories. And some people won't like him because of it anymore. And he will become one figure amongst many again. If it's the latter, it's the former, he'll gain greater popularity. And yeah, he's going to essentially be starting his own church. When Brett put it that way, I was like, that's what I've been thinking. And thank you for putting it that way. Because I think that's it. My criticism has always been that he treats the Bible like a psychological lens. And I'm like, but it's more than that too. It reveals something about the transcendent as well. That this tells us something about who God is as well. And that's a good thing, and that's an important thing. And that these limits and these stories manifest that. So that's kind of my sense of the direction, at least. And it kind of encapsulates my hesitations about him as well.
Okay, Father David?
I've read two articles that are critical of Dr. Peterson. One of them was by Brett Fawcett. Two articles that I liked or I thought were intelligent. One was Brett Fawcett's, and the other one was by an author of whom I can't say. And that author was basically saying one of the things that Father Harrison was basically just saying is that this guy is teaching Christians where they need to step up their game. This is the interesting thing about freedom and action. Is that one of the things that I found is you can have a plot driving to a particular crescendo, but you can't necessarily demonstrate where it's going to wind up going. So Chesterton made a joke about this. He says you can't deduce that Achilles would have given Priam the body of his son Hector by a mathematical theorem. And so you can take the data in terms of where it's building for what Peterson is doing in his life. But in a strange way, I think the reason that he's not trying to join a church or anything like that is actually assigned to his credit. He's not trying to join a faction. He wants to find the answers. He wants to find the truth. And he finds limitations in a lot of the Christian denominations or how they're articulated. So in a sense, I prefer just to give the man some time. Because on one level, I'm thankful he's not Catholic.
Right.
My brother because my brother and I went to one of the second lecture that I went with my brother. And my brother joked and said that one of the best ways...
Father, pardon, the cameras are over there.
God bless the cameras. I need to think.
Go to the deep then, okay.
Yeah, dive into the deep. That's actually the point. Sometimes people act out symbolically what they're thinking without even actually articulating it. So my brother was pointing out that if it was a Christian speaking up there, he would not nearly have the same cachet. And one of my favorite thinkers ever never became Catholic, and that was C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. And in another way, although it probably might have been better or happier for him had he done so, who knows? That's not my job. I'm not God, nor do I want that job description. On one level, he proved to be more beneficial as an ecumenical figure, precisely because he wasn't. Saint Edith Stein, whom we're celebrating today, although gave her life for the Jewish people, in her own words, can sometimes be a sore point in Catholic-Jewish relations. So I don't quite know where to go with it. There is definitely a propensity for him to become cult-like.
Yeah.
But the first lecture I attended, that was the one about Jacob and God fighting with each other. Somebody at the very beginning of the lecture, and it wasn't recorded, said, "You're the greatest, you're the best." And he's like, I forget his exact words, it's like, "You got to fix your standards there, buddy." There is a tremendous modesty to him.
Yeah.
I finished my new book yesterday. Hopefully it's as good as I can make it. I don't know if it's any good, but it's as good as I can make it anyways.
And in fact, a forgetfulness of self that is not as common, especially even among clergy. Mm-hmm. You know, like one of the things that is easily the most irritating among priests is when they just kind of assume that the mission of the gospel belongs to them. So he, at least I find that encouraging, that he doesn't treat this mission as something that is directly his own. So for that, I'm very thankful. So it's kind of hard to put it into larger words. So I would prefer just to let freedom play itself out, because he's dealing with issues and questions that we theologians haven't understood. And so that rapprochement is his vocation. It's his life. It's his business. But I won't even pray for his conversion, and maybe in a way I am, but what I'm actually doing is I'm just thankful he's doing his job.
Can I add them? Sure. I mean, I think in some ways, when you've kind of carved the path that he's carved, I think it's going to, one day, he's just going to fall from the light, one way or another. Because either he's going to become Catholic, or people are going to hate him. It's going to become a cult, and so he'll have great devotees, but then everyone else is going to hate him because he's a cult leader or something to that effect. Or he's going to continually looking for the answer for 50 years. People get tired of people continue looking for the answer but not giving it to them, or not offering them a glimpse into the answer. When you're a guy looking for the meaning of things, and you keep on saying, "I haven't found the ultimate basis for all meaning," and you do that for a long time, people just tire out. And I say, "Fine, I'm going to go somewhere else because I'm looking for answers, and you've stopped giving them to me." And that's why I say, I agree. I totally agree with your point about you kind of have to let this freedom do what it does. For me, it's more on the audience side of things.
Sure,
I would say. Of the type of career he's or persona he's kind of carved for himself now in the public sphere forces him to make a choice. In a way, he's going to have to make one eventually, and it may be to continue doing what he's doing. But if he does, he'll still have a following and everything, but he's not going to be as prominent as he is today.
You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Yep.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
This is interesting, though. I don't, we've reached that Father Harrison definitive speech. But ultimately, this career is not his ultimate job, right? He's a father, he's a husband, and everyone just kind of has their, like, this is not the Warhol thing of a few minutes of, you guys even had a joke about this in one of your 15 seconds of fame. One of my favorite comedians, Norm Macdonald, about a different kind of comment he was referring to, like, we think that life is like a long-term story, but it's often just a snapshot. And there are certain things, in a sense, that will be remembered for. Like when you go through the Missal and you read the lives of the saint, it only probably tells you about 3 things. But you can only imagine the small choices that had to aggregate over a long period of time to get us to a particular point, and how we in the larger body of Christ There are choices that people made for years and years before I was born that led me to where I am today, and I'm thankful for those people. And then I will be another cog in somebody else's life, or maybe another organ in their part in the body of Christ. It's better to talk body image than machinery image. So in a sense, that's the part I'm thankful for, because we in the church have used figures that would have not normally been our allies for some time. Plato and Aristotle remain the two most significant figures. One of the reasons I like Chesterton is that he was one of the first ones to really, not that he was the first, but to really take mythology seriously and its impact on how we interpret the symbols of faith. And who knows, in a sense, how a person could help us. And then you could also have a person who's the stalwart, proclaimer of a faith or proclaimer of an idea, and they can turn out just to be batshit crazy, like Tertullian. You can't quite figure out who's going to wind up becoming the Gnostic, who's going to wind up actually becoming the saint. You let it play out, because it is a grand mystery. And the fact that Father Harrison and I have our differences, not just in beer preferences, not that this is necessarily my favorite, but that we're quite content to have a good argument and see things through. So cheers, man.
Cheers.
I know you're pretty much done, Father Royer, but...
Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this special episode of Left-Footers, filmed in front of a live studio audience.
Woo!
And there was much rejoicing.
Yes.
Please follow these guys on Twitter.
No, just him.
Just him. Just follow him, and probably listen to Father Hogman's homilies online somewhere, right? No, they don't exist. Okay.
Moving on.
Please like and subscribe and support us in every and any way you can.